Hello, everyone. I'm so glad you're here tonight. As always, Parent Chat is all about bringing us together as parents to talk about the issues that are going on in the teen world, parenting world, the young kid world. So thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedule and being here. We'd like to start tonight by showing you all of the great stuff that we have coming up. After this wonderful parent chat, we've got so many more things coming. We have the parent chat, of course, coming back for the spring quarter. And as you can see, we've got some great things in the lineup about codependence, about anxiety, anger, screen time, how to motivate kids. All of these are things that we're hearing from parents that you want to know more about. So we are bringing that for you. And then after that, we've got mindful moments for teens. We have parenting for emotional well-being, and then a session for parents that's for middle school parents or their kids are entering middle school. So check out all of these. We'll be sending them out in emails, Facebook, all of that. So tonight we have a really extra special presentation. It's something that I think we often overlook. We don't really talk about. We see things on the news about it. And we as parents can feel very helpless when it comes to extremism. So we've brought somebody in that we are very thankful. He's taken the time to do this. His job is not doing parent education, but he has created some wonderful slides and a great presentation so that we as parents can understand what to look for, how they're getting these kids into these extremist groups, and what you can do about it. We don't want to just leave you like scared. We want to leave you prepared. So that's what tonight is all about. So Enrique, I'd invite you to come on the screen and introduce yourself and just let us know a little bit about you, and then we can dive in to your amazing presentation.
All right. Everybody see me? Everybody hear me?
Yes.
All right. Hello, I'm Enrique Nusi. I'm a senior research associate at the Center on Terrorism, Extremism, and Counterterrorism at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey. A bit about myself. I've been at the center for about 2 years now, working on various research projects for the center dealing with extremism, particularly on social media, as well as a few other more academic-focused research projects for certain government agencies, like DHS is one of our big ones right now. Here to talk to you guys, give you guys a quick overview of sort of what's going on in the world of extremism, what's going on in sort of the world of violence in real world that originates from online interactions. And I just want to give parents a brief overview of that, what it looks like, what some of the research says about potential causes and outcomes, and what you can do to identify and perhaps even counteract some of this. It's very important. It's very prevalent, and it can be scary sometimes, but I want to take some of the veil off of that, take away some of the mystery of this, and hopefully leave you guys a little more informed, a little better armed to handle these issues going forward.
Amazing. While you're bringing up your slides, Enrique, I want to ask everyone, if you have questions, you can put those in the Q&A box so they don't get lost. The Q&A is usually down at the bottom. And the chat box, any comments along the way. And I'd love to ask, what brought all of you to tonight's presentation? What are you hoping to learn? Have you seen something that kind of made you think I need to go watch this? And that'll just give us some insight. All right, Enrique, take it over.
All right, thank you. To start off with, does everyone see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So, all right, yes, as I said, I'm with CTEC. We're a new organization, but we've got some pretty profound research going on right now into this world. So I'm going to present this to you in the most concise form that I can. Let's see. There we go. So presentation title, Trends in Violent Extremism and Youth. Presented by myself. If you would like to contact us for any additional information, we have a center email right there. You're more than welcome to reach out to us at anytime you'd like. All right, so just bottom line up front, starting out, go over this quickly. Big takeaways from this presentation to be that isolation is critical and you need to identify it early. Also to be aware and open about your child's online activity, and also to emphasize empathy. And we will get into more detail about each of these right now. So the first thing I want to talk about is isolation. It is one of the most common factors in youth violent extremism. We've seen this in numerous attacks, particularly the Isla Vista attack with Elliot Rogers, the Virginia Tech attack with Sung Hee Cho, and the Toronto van attack, which was hailed as the start of the quote unquote incel revolution, which we will get into in a little bit. Particularly the Virginia Tech attack is a pretty good case study in why isolation can lead to violent outcomes. Sung Hee Cho was a South Korean citizen. He suffered severe depression and was ostracized from early childhood, growing up in South Korea. He later attended college in the US, but had difficulty integrating into the surrounding social environment, especially in his final year. In his inability to enter a romantic relationship, he began exhibiting misogynistic attitudes, particularly exhibiting inappropriate behavior towards female students, which resulted in verbal disciplinary action twice from Virginia Tech staff. A lack of suitable psychiatric and other mental health care may have also been a contributing factor. But one thing we do know for sure is that isolation played a pretty critical factor in Sung Hee Cho's mental decline and later move to commit this violent action against his fellow students at Virginia Tech. So isolation does not always mean antisocial. People may still reach out to form relationships, especially online, where anonymity imparts a feeling of security that may not be present in offline interactions. However, this may leave people vulnerable to recruitment by extremist actors who seek to take advantage of these vulnerable people to bring them into their fold and basically give them a sense of family and belonging that they may not have had outside of that. Social, romantic rejection are other forms of isolation that are important to catch early, as rejection is a common theme in quote unquote black pill ideology, which we will get into later on in the presentation. Let's see, discussion of social rejection, especially romantic. It's a common rhetorical pattern that we see in a lot of really toxic online spaces, especially incel specific forums or forums like 4chan, where there may be a special emphasis on the inability to enter a relationship or to maintain friend groups, and just a general feeling of apathy towards society in general, just due to this general disconnection that exists between the person and society. All right, so online activity continued on here. Seeking out authoritative spaces is sort of the general thing that kind of brings people into these circles. When we talk about authoritative spaces, we're talking about authoritative spaces in which niche hobbies are interacted with, are celebrated with, they're played, they're central to these fora. Just a few examples up on the screen here. It's not an exhaustive list by any means, but if you've heard of Warhammer 40K, it's a tabletop role-playing game that involves miniatures. It's very, very niche, although it is one of the most popular tabletop games that isn't like Dungeons and Dragons sort of to date. You go to any sort of card store or hobby store, and you're likely to see Warhammer 40K stuff all over the walls and sort of people playing it on the weekends. The icon there, the blue one, that's for the video game marketplace Steam, very popular with PC gamers. Very strong social networking features there that you might not be aware of. Kids can go on there, they can comment on their favorite video games, upload screenshots, but they also might want to talk about sort of their social issues too. And again, this might be where the vulnerable kind of fall into that trap of being recruited by these extremist groups or milieus or circles. Even something as innocent as Pokemon can kind of lead you to these quote unquote authoritative spaces in which a lot of this discussion is happening. So sort of being aware of your child's hobby is very important in determining sort of like what online activities is normal versus what might be unhealthy. Preliminary, yes.
Can I jump in here for a second?
Absolutely.
I just want to clarify and tell me if I'm wrong. You're not saying that if your child is on these, you need to get them off right away. You're saying if they're on these, it's just a more vulnerable space. So you need to be more aware.
It can be, yes, especially if they're gravitating towards less of the official forums and more towards the unofficial things.
Yeah.
Places like Reddit, places like 4chan, Kiwi Farms. These are places that are very much in the know as far as quote unquote nerd culture goes.
Yeah.
But again, they're very toxic places and can be very dangerous for impressionable young minds to be around. Preliminary research that we've done in CTech has shown pretty strongly significantly positive correlation between time spent playing video games or in these hobbies and association with violent radical milieus present in such spaces. So again, it's not that you see your kid playing Warhammer or painting miniatures or something like that. You don't be afraid, just be a little more aware of kind of what they're doing in their off time, and maybe try and engage them a little bit with it. So where do these authoritative spaces sort of lead people down? Again, to say, like, this isn't every single case scenario. Some people might just go on 4chan, avoid the nastier discussions, and just sort of be there to engage with people about video games or their hobbies, or see kind of what the most popular thing is. However, when it kind of veers away from that, people in these spaces might be exposed to pill ideologies that we might have heard about, pretty nasty misogyny, and even toxic positivity in some cases. These are things that can offer easy explanations or solutions to very complex problems, and often take the form of blaming an other rather than encouraging accountability of the self. And that's sort of where the toxicity comes from when we're talking about these spaces. Cultures of harassment, organized trolling are very common in some of these spaces, Kiwi Farms being a particularly notable one. One term you might hear is lolcow culture. This might be new to some of you guys, but this culture has seen a robust organized trolling apparatus grow around certain eccentric online personalities. Several of these targeted people have been harassed into degraded mental health states, some having gone as far as committing suicide. Kiwi Farms has been blamed for 3 suicides since 2016, actually. Again, there's no pinning any solid proof on this. Obviously, it's also amorphous. It's really difficult to prove, but the organized trolling that does originate from these spaces is often attributed to these suicides. Chloe Sagal in particular was one noted one, as well as Near/View, who was a well-known video game emulation, who wrote a well-known video game emulation software that these were both targeted for eccentric behavior, as well as for their transgender identity and their advocacy. And of course, this is years of harassment that led to these issues just being too much for them to bear, until they thought they had no other choice but to take their life, unfortunately. So again, this is, it might not always manifest in school shootings. Sometimes it just manifests as harassment towards someone who might be different than them, or think different, or just be a little eccentric or a little out there. So again, things to be aware of when we're talking about online activity. Now, when we're talking about trolling and attacks outside of online spaces, isolation is a huge factor in that, but sometimes more so, status seeking can be a pretty big factor in that as well. Status seeking, which may drive these cultures of harassment, has also been noted as a motivator in several well-known mass shooting incidents. In particular, the Columbine shooting, where the 2 perpetrators of Columbine weren't necessarily isolated or ostracized, maybe seen as a little weird, but they had friends, they had girlfriends even, but in this case, they were status seeking. They were looking to have this sort of veneer of notoriety by committing this horrible act in which they would be nationally recognized in sort of the worst way possible. However, most of the harassment that we do see online, not necessarily taking this form. A lot of it is just sort of the normal social media harassment that you hear about, the sort of the kids bullying each other online, and just it really messing with their mental state. Even without an active bullying component, I'm sure we've all heard sort of the story about young girls on Instagram that, they kind of see these idealized photos every day, and that leads to harm to self-confidence, general mental well-being, just sort of a general feeling of being unable to compare to sort of the idealized version that people put online. So yeah, paying attention to what's going on with your kids' online lives it's tantamount to like knowing what's going on in general with your kids, just as important as knowing what's going on with your friends with your kids when they're going out with their friends.
On the pill ideologies, are you going to go into that in more detail later? I think you said you are.
I am, yes.
Okay, great.
So I just wanted to cover sort of the basics of sort of what goes on online these days.
Excellent. And one more clarification
Yes.
question. You mentioned something about authoritative space on the previous slide. What
Yes.
exactly do you mean by that?
When I say authoritative spaces, again, I'm just saying places where fans of certain fandoms, so video game, like a fan of a certain video game or a fan of a certain, like a movie or something like that, they might want to know more about sort of, that game or that movie. They might want to delve more into the story or kind of the fan theories behind something. And an authoritative space would just be somewhere where someone can explore that without sort of any real need for having to seek someone out in real life.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay, I hope that clears that up.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so let's see, we can move on to, all right. So I do want to talk about who recruits. And I know this is a big one for parents wanting to know sort of who might be looking for their kids, just as any parent would be very cautious about this sort of thing. And to start out, I do want to emphasize that violence doesn't always originate from an organized group. A lot of the shootings that we do see, they would be considered what we might call a lone wolf attack. So just an individual actor who might be primed for this sort of thinking by spending a lot of time in these online spaces where they're exposed to these really toxic ideologies. And they, again, want to kind of seek that status. They've been isolated from sort of a normal in real life group for so long that it's disconnected. Like real life to them is what they see online, essentially. And to gain status, to further their legitimacy as some sort of an authority of themselves, they might be pushed to commit these attacks, these atrocities, again, to seek notoriety. Additionally, some of these just might be regular old conflicts among friends, relatives that get violent, as well as collateral damage and injury that might result from that. So again, it's not always neo-Nazi groups that are perpetrating these acts. Sometimes it's just a kid that got too lonely and no one caught that early enough, no one engaged him or her, and it got out of hand and became just a tragedy. So sort of the next step up from that might be, we're talking about like organized trolling. It often has no official sponsor. So when I say names like 4chan or Kiwi Farms, and when I say it's really difficult to attribute any suicide or any negative outcomes to them in particular, this is what I'm talking about, is that the trolling is organized on these spaces. Just like you can organize a rally in a Starbucks, but that doesn't necessarily make Starbucks the perpetrator of any violence that occurs at that rally, so to speak. Although these spaces do really enable these things to occur and to coalesce, that's, again, sort of that really nasty gray zone that we're talking about here. Now, where the danger kind of comes from with that is that it's not always a single group driving it, but someone may splinter off from these spaces to conduct this harassment without the approval of the group. Again, to seek notoriety. However, when it comes back to the group, the harassment can often be hand-waved away by claiming that it's online discussion. It's just for laugh, as in the parlance of these places, they often just say, we're doing it for the lulz. So that way they could just say, the victim, they could have just ignored this, they could have avoided it if they just stopped being so weird. It's that sort of victim blaming language that we do here coming out of these spaces after something really horrible happens. And oftentimes we'll even see them celebrate it too. So again, if they didn't commit it, they were celebrating it, there's kind of nothing that can be done about that, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. Violence stemming from known extremist groups. Now, this is kind of where we're talking about the nastier stuff here. Violence stemming from the extremist groups tend to manifest in organized volatile protests, criminal activity. We've seen this during the J6 Capitol insurrection. A lot of people who were radicalized online, they fled to these, or they gathered in these places and decided to participate in these protests that got violent. I'm sure a lot of them just went there thinking, oh, it's going to be, just some funny trolling, trolling the libs or whatever, and it got out of hand. And well, no, it turns out that there's actually some there's, there's actually some evidence coming out of Congress right now saying that this looks like it might have been like a legitimate plot by some of these groups to overthrow the government. And that's obviously a really scary notion, especially when we're talking about kids being in some of these places, kids being in some of these online spaces. Violent motorist attack on protests in Charlottesville is another example of this. Just people who planned this online to meet in one place, and they just like got way out of hand. And of course, one that was thwarted was the plot by a radical militia to kidnap the governor of Michigan. I'm sure we all had heard of that at one point or another. We do have a question from Chris Wegman, which I will answer at the end of my presentation, if that's all right.
Okay. Yep.
Excuse me. So, should probably just, there we go. So getting more into the group side of things, what to look for. If you start hearing your kids talk about involuntary celibates, incels, I'm sure some of us have heard of that, some of us haven't. Might be hearing this for the first time tonight. Just know that it is referring to a radical misogynistic belief system. It alleges that women have a disproportionate amount of power in sexual selection, and that a lot of this can be blamed on modern phenomena such as feminism and the women's rights movements. And this is entirely responsible for their inability to enter into romantic relationships. They also accuse these movements of stifling masculinity and reversing the natural order, quote unquote, are arguments you hear coming out of the incel movement. And this actually originates in the 1970s. The term incels was used in academic research to identify men who had forming relationships with women. Before then, you might have heard the term referred to as love shy. So men who just have difficulty approaching women, or vice versa, women who have difficulty in approaching men or their preferred gender. It really doesn't matter, though. It is men that we do tend to see this with, heterosexual men that have difficulty entering into relationships that tend to gravitate towards incel ideology. Incels who succumb to their despair over this inability may claim to have taken the black pill. When you start hearing phrasing like that, they've taken the black pill, or they start even talking about black pill, that's a pretty big red flag, because when we've typically seen black pill in the past, that is indicative that someone may be primed to take violent action. The Toronto van attack in particular was believed to be a critical factor in driving this person to commit this attack. So it is associated with known violent incidents. So when you do hear this, this is something that you should, I'm not saying it's something you go straight to the police with, but it is something that you should sit down with your child and discuss with them at length. Find out, where are they hearing this from? Why are they using it? What are your feelings about this? And just understand, these, until they go on to commit an act, these people aren't monsters. A lot of people that are buying into this ideology are just, a lot of them are just lonely. They just are having trouble forming those relationships, and it just needs to be brought out into the open to the best of your ability. Now, within these milieus as well, in some milieu especially, Elliot Rogers, who committed the Isla Vista attack in 2014, he's particularly venerated in these circles as having taken sort of that step that a lot of these guys wish they could take, especially the ones that are just at their wits' end about it. So any talk you hear about Saint Elliot, for instance, it's the term they use to refer to him, or Elliot Rogers just as a full name. Again, this is something to be worried about, and that you should sit down and talk with their kid and ask them what's going on. This guy did this horrible thing. He, killed these girls in the sorority. We don't want the same thing that happened to him to happen to you. It's really how I would approach it. Mm-hmm. Now, moving on to the next pill ideology here. Red pill ideology, I'm sure it's one that we've all heard. It's an amalgamation of various conspiracy theories that are said to awaken the adherent to some deeper truth that underneath the veneer of, mass media or sort of the general society, that influence is really controlled by a small number of people that are they're manipulating society in nefarious and often detrimental ways that are harming regular people, is sort of the broadest stroke that I can paint this with. Sort of at large, it's a radical conspiracy theorist milieu. It's often associated with the far right, but what we're increasingly seeing is that it's pretty nonpartisan in a lot of cases, as there are some far left and nonpartisan adherents to it. Joe Rogan, who many people often describe as being far right, is probably a little closer to a radical centrist, if there was such a thing, but certainly not what we would consider far right in our space. Just, he hosts a lot of conspiracy theorists, and he's kind of the example I like to use to say, like, it's not just the far right, it's sort of anyone who falls into these radical conspiracy theories that eventually lead them to this desire to overthrow the government or something like that.
Enrique, is this based off of the Matrix? Is that where the red pill comes from?
Oh yeah, that's red pill, blue pill. So
Gotcha.
Red pill, you take the red pill, you go down the rabbit hole, see how far it goes. Blue pill, you stay in Wonderland and just go back to sleep.
Gotcha.
And when we do hear people in the red pill milieu talking, they're typically the ones who like to use the pill analogies. So they'll say anyone who's still unawakened to these ideologies are still taking the blue pill. Sometimes it can be a catch-all for people who vote Democrat or who hold liberal beliefs, but more often than not, it's just, oh, they haven't been red pilled yet, they're still blue pill. Might hear the purple pill to refer to someone who is sort of like red pill light. Let's see, green pill might refer to someone who's like a staunch environmentalist, but kind of falls into that conspiracy theory of like everything is like an OPEC conspiracy. Pink pill is referring to LGBTQ positive conspiracy theories or radical feminism. Essentially, it kind of starts losing its meaning as sort of like this conspiracy theory thing, and starts being like just a catch-all for, he's taking the pink pill, then he's subscribing to feminist beliefs. That's essentially what all these mean. But really, red pill is just sort of the big famous one that we all heard of. That that's sort of this radical conspiracy theorist that, again, you hear your kids talking about any of these pill analogies. It's good to talk with them and just let them know that a lot of the conspiracy theories that are around these pill ideologies have been thoroughly debunked, and just
yeah. I think the big conversation is, if you, like you're saying, if you start to hear these terms, they're getting it from somewhere. So that's the conversation that you need to have, is figure out where they're learning these things from.
Yes, where they're learning it from, why they're gravitating to these spaces, and what it's going to take to, kind of pull them out of it before it becomes like a really ugly thing, because people will take advantage of this. So anyways, the next one that I do want to touch on briefly, we don't see this one nearly as much, but it is sort of falling into that thing that we're seeing kind of a little more on the left, but also sort of like nonpartisan, is toxic positivity. And I do want to state that a lot of these movements started out with just really noble intentions to bring attention to people with different body shapes, or bring attention to people with real disabilities that just, they need that extra bit of visibility to say, hey, these guys are here. Let's stop giving them a hard time, and at least do a little bit more to make their lives a little easier. But this is sort of kind of morphed into its own. It's taken on a life of its own. One that I do like to bring up often is the fat acceptance movement. This is one that kind of started out by saying, like, there are very large people in this country. Obesity is a huge epidemic in this country, and we do need to be aware that that people are bigger than they were 40, 50 years ago, and that it's just a reality. We need to be working towards making sure people are healthy, but at the same time too, we need to not be harassing people or discriminating for that. And that's kind of turned into a thing of people starting to celebrate obesity. We see this with certain influencers like Virgie Tovar, a little bit with Tess Holiday, but not as much. But Virgie Tovar is one I like to bring up a lot. who celebrates obesity, who says that there's nothing wrong with it, that it leads to no health consequences whatsoever if you just eat whatever you want. Just, her thing is just eat whatever, be happy, and being fat is not associated with any sort of health consequences whatsoever. And that's kind of where toxic positive, what I mean when I say toxic positivity is ignoring the consequences of harmful lifestyles, promoting them, rather than focusing on tolerance and treatment. So mental illness is fashionable is another one we do see. That one's pretty controversial because there are some people that are fashionable who also have mental illness issues, but there are some people who take that to another direction and say, oh, I've got bipolar disease and this is my whole personality, and it's something that they actively try to glorify, and it can be really unhealthy. It's thankfully not as common as sort of the other things we've been talking about with incel milieu and red pill ideology. But again, if you do see these sort of things happening, it could be a red flag that something deeper is going on with your child, and it's just something that you need to be aware of and talk to them about. So yeah, just leading off on that note, I do want to start getting into a little bit of the actual groups that we do look at. Political and identitarian extremist groups. So these are organized extremist groups that have increased in prevalence in the decade of the late 2010s. Recruiters, they do target youth who don't necessarily easily identify with their immediate peer or social groups. Many of them seek to recruit isolated individuals who may not readily connect with their peers. And research that we've done on this has discovered a fervent effort by extremist group to recruit people who do suffer this isolation, but also people with autism spectrum disorders. They target them for their perceived intelligence, attention to minute detail, or obsessive nature. And because of this, we have seen a pretty deliberate effort to target these individuals for recruitment. So again, another thing to be aware of is if your child has been diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder and they are engaging in these on these platforms, that that's another thing to just be aware of. Just make sure that you're talking with your kid about sort of the dangers of extremist groups if you can. If you can mention groups that I've mentioned here specifically, see if you get a reaction out of that. See if they know what these groups are about, because frankly, a lot of these groups up here are they're violent. They embrace forms of sort of one size fits all supremacy, white supremacy in particular. Antifa, obviously, the decentralized movement is a little harder to track, but again, the militant movement, the militant wing of the Antifa movement is also something to be worried about, as well as the more virulent neo-Nazi movements like the Fear Creek Division, Iron Youth, Proud Boys, sort of any of the hardcore neo-Nazi groups that we've talked about in the past. Let's see. Religious extremist groups, we do see a bit of their influence waning in recent days. However, it's because the numbers are declining. It doesn't mean that they're any less influential in policy. We do see an increasingly toxic core membership remaining. They do retain tremendous influence in some areas of government policy, as we've seen in some of the push to enact anti-transgender laws. The Don't Say Gay bill is one of the more prevalent ones, and the anti-abortion laws as well. Islamist movements have obviously had a lot of coverage in the news over the last couple of decades, given the war in Afghanistan. However, as that's concluded and sort of the focus on the Middle East has declined in recent years, a lot of it has to do with ISIS's shrinking influence in the Middle Eastern region. However, that doesn't mean that they aren't prevalent at all. They do still maintain a robust influence network, and they do maintain an operative network as well. However, Christian identity is sort of the other side of that coin. That's a little more on the domestic side of things, as well as the European side of things. And again, these movements, while their numbers are not as robust as they used to be, they are increasingly successful at pushing their policy preferences into the mainstream. So again, this one might not be as relevant nowadays, but again, if your family is religious and you do hear your child increasingly talking about sort of the more extreme tenets of some of these religions' beliefs that are not appropriate within your own household, that this is something to be aware of, that these groups are still active and that they still do seek recruits and influence in the political sphere. So with that, I do just want to close out with sort of recapping again, isolation, to pay attention and engage when you do notice isolation. Be aware of your child's social situation and friend groups or lack thereof. If a child appears isolated from their peer group, engage, learn why. Figure out what you can do about that, whether it's encouraging your child to participate in after-school activities, in extracurriculars, or barring that, if you don't want to push them towards academic, encouraging them to engage in a hobby in a real life space, in a game store, for instance, if they're into Warhammer, in hobby shops, gyms, things like that, where they can have people in real life that may not look like them, that may not think like them, just to be around those, to be around that crowd. Be open about online activity. Familiarize yourself with new and emerging apps, especially their icons and usage, which we will talk about a little bit. Communicate clearly about what is and is not acceptable for you and your family as far as internet usage goes, and just be generally aware of what's going on. Track, their usage time, how much time they're spending alone in their room with their computer, just things like that, especially if there is isolation noticed in this context. And finally, emphasize the importance of empathy. I didn't talk about this too much, but I do want to stress it here, as I do want to leave off on this, is that one thing we found consistently in the research is that low tolerance of others is associated with hateful views and action. One single view may not tell a group's entire story. Encouraging engagement, even if it's just taking them down to somewhere outside of their comfort space to engage with someone who doesn't think or look or believe like them. That's important. Even if they don't become best friends, they can still talk with someone and realize, it's just a normal person like me that, they got the same problems, they got the same concerns that I might have. And, okay, maybe the guy's not my best friend now, but at the very least, I've talked to him. I know that he's out there, and, maybe he's not so bad after all. Is sort of just the outcome that you want when you're thinking about exposure to people that just aren't like them. Just increase that empathy and hopefully bring them out of this isolation a little bit too. And
Yes,
with
Enrique,
that, yes.
I'll just say on this, you and I talked about this before we came on live. The whole idea of creating empathy is something that we as parents can role model in everyday life. And one thing that I notice, especially when elections come up, right, is that we tend to speak in such, like, there's no gray. You're either on this team and you're a good guy, or you're on this team and you're not a good guy. And so we have to be aware of, when we're talking about all of like the policies that we don't agree with, or the politicians we don't agree with, that are we still leaving room for empathy in those difficult conversations? So I think it starts from, sometimes it's a good place, a good meaning from us as parents, but yet we're forgetting the empathy in there.
Yes, and that is an excellent point to leave off on, is that politics by definition is just determining how resources in a society are divided, not necessarily who should be able to say what or do what, just simply how things should be split up among people. And we always tend to conflate this with sort of these ideological wars and just these really nasty things that you're right, we always forget about. This guy's my neighbor, he's not my enemy. And to emphasize empathy is just, it's one way to sort of, perhaps in a way in the future to help heal some of our national division as well. I mean, not to kind of get off on that tangent, but
Yeah, it's true. It's true. So Enrique is going to show us some apps that we might need to look for, but I want to just take a pause for a moment in case anybody has any burning questions. You can put those in the chat box. We'll be looking for that. While you're thinking of what those questions are, I wanted to ask Enrique about isolation, right? This is one thing that is core to everything you're telling us. And it's no, everybody understands these last 2 years were all about isolation for our kids.
Yes.
So as we're emerging, what I'm seeing as someone who works with teens is the kids who are feeling isolated don't know how to unisolate themselves. Like they want to, but they just, because they're like on this developmental pause for 2 years, they don't know what to do next. So my question for you is, have you seen an uptick in things in the last couple of years? I guess there's the pandemic, some other things going on, of course. So what have you seen?
So obviously mental health has become much more prevalent in sort of the public discourse these days, just sort of as a general trend over the last decade or so, but even more so now that we've had isolation during the pandemic. While we do see people sort of returning to normal life and returning to sort of going out and being out and about with people, this has been just a huge unprecedented sort of, I don't want to say national, but it's a global experiment really of sorts of what happens when we lock people up for 2 years straight and they can't really do much, without really taking a huge risk of getting sick with this disease we know nothing about. Now, what we've seen, obviously in the early days of COVID, was a lot more domestic violence and a lot more stress placed on people that kind of resulted in that. And whether that's a case of isolation and violence propagated by sort of these online spaces that I was talking about, you really can't say yet. The data just hasn't been collated enough yet for us to really make any solid conclusions, and there hasn't been enough time for us to see the outcome of this, like I said, quote unquote experiment. Now, in the context of parents keeping an eye on their kids about isolation, if you see that your kid's making an earnest effort to get out there, hang out with friends again, obviously maybe it's just a little harder because people are kind of used to being on their iPads all the time and talking to their friends that way. That's one thing. Now it's the other kind of isolation that I'm really worried about, that we should be keeping a closer eye on, is if a kid's not really making an active effort to go out with friends, to spend time with friends, or to kind of get out of their comfort space, their bubble, so to speak. That's really what we should be looking for. Again, even if your kid is making an earnest effort to get out and hang out with friends again and sort of be out of the house and just having trouble with it, you can try and help. Me personally, I'd probably be a little more laissez-faire with it and let them kind of make their own mistakes. But if it's to the point where they're just unable to, there's an anxiety component involved in there, let's say, that might be somewhere where you want to seek the help of a professional counselor. That would just be a little beyond my own wheelhouse to make any real suggestion or recommendation on that. Just because, again, it is such a new phenomenon that we're just beginning to understand the consequences of now.
Right. Thanks for that. Let's go back to the question that we had earlier. You promised us you would answer about the concept of collateral damage injury. Do you want to kind of clarify that a little bit?
Yes, that's it's sort of a catch-all for if someone gets involved in violence. Again, I'm not talking about extremist violence here. I'm talking about violence that might occur between friends or a family, and maybe someone just gets pulled into it. Someone's in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they decide to throw a punch too. Just sort of those random acts of violence that can occur when emotions run high, and it's just something that's, I don't want to say uncontrollable, but yeah, in a way it's kind of uncontrollable. Just that's all I mean by collateral damage. Just the random violence that might occur as a result of someone else's action. That's kind of why I try to tie it into the two.
One thing that you mentioned was the Columbine shooting, and you mentioned status seeking for some of these awful situations. And I know that kids, especially with TikTok challenges and things of that sort, really egg each other on. And it sounds like in the Columbine situation, there was kind of the two of them had this idea and just kept building on it and got excited about this horrible thing they were going to do. Are you seeing some of that also? Like when somebody is trying to recruit someone into their extremism, then the teens kind of are egging each other on within that?
Well, I'm going to say if these are teens or if these are guys in their 20s or people in their early 30s, it's really hard to say. But yeah, we do see a bit of that sometimes. You know, we might see like someone online say like, "Oh, I'm feeling terrible. I'm gonna commit suicide." And, you know, someone might come out and say, you know, like, "Oh, you know, do it, you coward," you know, something like that in polite terms. But that's sort of encouragement that we might see. But as far as being in these spaces, you know, people who get into like really violent things, like the Columbine shooters were really into the violent side of gun culture. You can't have a side of gun culture that is just about, you know, sport shooting, hunting, you know, not necessarily, you know, violent in the way that they want to, you know, go shooting all the way, like go shooting people. But
Yeah.
you know, there is that side of the hobby that it does get pretty dark. And these guys, from what I understand, were pretty deep into that side of the gun hobby. And a lot of the discussion that goes on in this kind of circle is, you know, if I had the guts, you know, I would go, you know, shoot up Congress, or, you know, I would shoot up, you know, a president's office or something. Again, just theoretical, you know, obviously these are a lot of people just blowing steam off, but, you know, eventually people get this idea in their head that, oh, you know, if I do this, you know, I could really, you know, make a name for myself. I could really get my name out there. You know? And again, I'm talking like it's, you know, some guy trying to, you know, go out there and make the next freaking iPhone or something.
Yeah.
You know, you know, now we're talking about like really violent stuff and people wanting to get, you know, their name out there. It's not necessarily that they're being egged on. It's just that they're being exposed to so much of this rhetoric and culture that they see like the ones who really make their mark in history are really the most infamous ones. Mm-hmm. So people who venerate Hitler, for instance, are, you know, they might be a little more prone to committing an act of mass violence to cement that notoriety that they want. Yeah. So that's really what we see most when we're talking about violent action resulting from online space, interactions in online spaces.
Okay. All right. So Enrique, I think your next slide is going to talk about some apps that we maybe should be looking out for.
Yes. There we go. So I do want to start off with the most popular mainstream online spaces that most of us will know most of these icons. I'm sure most parents know TikTok and Instagram. Fewer of you might be familiar with Twitch, which is a streaming platform similar to YouTube, but really more focused on live streaming video gameplay. A lot of really popular personalities on these websites that stream their gameplay. Some of the discussion can get pretty toxic. Some of the more infamous ones have gone on to jokingly venerate Nazi ideology and Hitler and things like that. Those are pretty infamous. PewDiePie was probably one of the more infamous instances of that, although he was specifically on YouTube. But we also do see this as sort of a space where there is a bit of misogyny going on as well, that should be noted. Twitter and Facebook less so, obviously, these days. Facebook is you know, more or less seen as kind of the boomer social media app, so to speak. The stereotype there is, oh, my mom's on Facebook, I don't want to be on that. You know, it's kids being kids. So, yep. But Twitter for sure is definitely one of those that can sort of get people to lead people to certain links that might not be so healthy. So most of these emphasize video sharing, photo sharing, and thrive on upvoting to attract views and to drive engagement. And all of this is in effort to appear favorable to a content algorithm that boosts your profile at the expense of others. So it encourages certain behaviors that may or may not be healthy for teens, that you just be aware that when your kids are using these, that these are problems that might arise. And you're seeing a little more of an oppressive attitude from your kid, and that they're really heavily into these things, that there might be an association there that is important to be aware of. Let's see, any resources on how to talk to kids about this stuff in their own language at their level. Yeah, you don't want to just kind of go in there and say like they're bad people and you can't, and I don't want you doing this, because then essentially you're creating a forbidden fruit situation. Oh yeah, Roblox is a pretty nasty one, on the worst end of it. But Roblox itself isn't all bad. Me personally, if I were to stop my kid from having a Roblox account, it would be really more for financial reasons than anything else, just because there is such a monetized component to it that I don't want to run the risk of my kid finding my Visa and then running $1,000 for costumes or something like that. But as far as talking to them in their own language, really, you just need to make it clear. You need to articulate what you feel about the thing that you're trying to tell your kid is bad. Figure out what it is about the thing that really makes you uncomfortable, and just be honest with them. Don't try to mince words with it. Don't try and sugarcoat it either. If you feel like Roblox is a place that's gonna be detrimental to your kid's mental health, just say, the evidence is showing, or the evidence is showing that. Sounds like a prescription drug commercial. But you just want to say it, like, be honest. I feel like if you do this, that you're going to get sucked into it, and it's not going to help you be a better person, or whatever your feelings are on it. Tips for filtering out the bad actors. Ooh, filtering out the bad actors on YouTube. Man, that's a presentation all on its own. It said he was triggered, a word we don't use in the home. Shortly after that, I read it. Pretend to be regular people, game streamers. Yeah, that's kind of he was triggered. That's all right. So again, this is just one of those things that 8 years old, I wouldn't feel too bad if I were making YouTube a living room thing. You can run YouTube to pretty much any TV that has an internet connection. If you don't have that, you can get a Roku, or stream from your phone or something like that. Pretty easily. Roku can run you about $50. Stream YouTube to that, connect their account to that, make it a family account if you can. I know it's probably not going to be super popular with your kid. It's really better than the alternative, though. Be open-minded, make it a comfortable environment for your kid to kind of be able to watch whatever they want, but that you can be next to them while they're watching it. Put it into context to yes, yeah, that's my best friend. She actually kind of put me onto that, because she's been raising her kid a long time now, and it's that was the first thing that I saw her do. This was just like, oh, okay, YouTube is a big TV thing. Homework and things like that, curiosity stream, all that can be like small screen stuff, but big screen stuff needs to be like the fun stuff needs to be the big screen stuff, basically the family time.
Well, and it also gets them out of their room, which decreases isolation, increases conversation. So
exactly.
I think
that can really be helpful.
And I think one of the things that you're talking about is this idea of setting limits. It's okay to set limits. You talk to your kids about it, why you're doing it, so that they understand. We can't bubble wrap them. Like, we can't keep them off of everything. But as you're saying, put it on the big screen. If they're watching something they're not supposed to be watching, they're not going to watch it on a big screen. So, have them on YouTube where you can kind of glance and see what they're up to. And the other thing I wanted to touch on is the idea of like Roblox and the things where the kids go, that there are people who are, as you're talking about extremism, there's people who are predators on there. So just teach your kids, if somebody's talking to you, you don't know them, what do you do? If there's someone who says, don't tell your parents, what do you do?
Yeah, so some of this, it's the obvious stuff that we've been learning since we were kids back in the day. It's kind of going back to the old stranger danger mentality. Just be a little bit suspicious when you're in these places, now that everything has a text feature or a voice chat feature. And kind of going back to the popular games with social features, Roblox, Fortnite, like even some of the more mature stuff like Counter-Strike Go, or the really strategic stuff like Hearts of Iron or Europa Universalis. Those social features also have features where you can mod things to look like Nazi uniforms, for instance, and that is something that people could be using to role play out their sort of their darker fantasies, which not always unhealthy, but again, when we're talking about like things that have historically resulted in sort of mass murder and just general human misery, these are things to be aware of, that if your kids engaging in these, that it's good to sit them down and explain the historical context behind things. So, because it's not always healthy, but so kind of going back to legacy online spaces, we only got a couple minutes, so I'll cover this quickly. Reddit, 4chan, Kiwi Farms, places like those. These are text-heavy forums that emphasize anonymity as a key feature. This is a format that's been popular since the 90s. It's continuing to influence pop culture, and this is thriving even today. Like, it doesn't matter that it's just, you know, simple image sharing and text. You know, this is where the unfortunately some of the biggest movers and shakers on the internet get the word out. You know, if there's a leak that happens from a popular game company, 4chan is probably the place where you're going to see it. You know, big news about, you know, game releases or, you know, popular hobbies or movies, you might see that on Reddit. Kiwi Farms, you know, eccentric personalities on the internet, that's probably where you're going to see that first. So again, just be aware when your kid's on these 4chan and Kiwi Farms, I'd be a little more leery about. I definitely sit them down to talk about sort of what's going on with that. But Reddit, you know, that's become a little more tame these days as the scrutiny's kind of come down on it. Anonymous messaging apps, I do want to touch on this real quick. Telegram, Signal, Snapchat, Discord, things like those. These are applications that make it really difficult to retrieve text messages and images that are sent. A lot of them are automatically deleted. Now that might sound pretty nefarious, and it can be, but do keep in mind that there are legitimate uses for this technology. It's popular in countries with authoritarian governments, but it is also popular with violent extremist organizations as well, and just, you know, more less savory actors in general. So if, let's say, your family is fleeing a government that is, you know, authoritarian in nature, and you just use these apps to talk to family and friends back home, that's one thing. That's something I wouldn't worry about too much. But, you know, if you're just kind of growing up in a safe neighborhood, suburbs or whatever, and you see your kids using these and you're not sure what they're doing with it, you know, ask them kind of what's going on with this, especially if you see these apps pop up on their phone. The Snapchat, a little less so. That's just everyone kind of uses that. But Telegram, Signal, if your kid's using Keybase, they're probably doing some like hacker stuff that might be good for their career in the future. But, you know, it's still, you know, it's still, these aren't always like the most, these aren't always used for the best of intentions. Anonymizing activity. So Tor and Onion are pretty popular for accessing places like Kiwi Farms or 4chan or 8kun or any of these kind of places. Brave Browser and Proton Mail, again, they're popular with, they are popular with less savory actors, but they're also popular with businesses who need to maintain a little bit more security in their browsing. So again, it's kind of a hit or miss, just really context dependent. You know, if you see these on your kid's phone, just, you know, hey, what's up with that? Or you just, oh, you know, I'm just being careful when I look online. It's not always a bad practice. Tor is a little more associated sort of with these less savory actors, but like Brave and Proton Mail, I mean, I use those for work sometimes too. So, and with that concludes my presentation. A minute over time.
That is great timing, Enrique. Thank you so much. You've given us a lot to think about. And I just want to remind parents, this is not meant to scare everybody and to tell you your kids should not be online at all. But really, you know, Enrique's message is to be involved and to have the conversations and just notice what they're doing. And I think a really big takeaway is if your child is isolated and they're kind of giving up even trying to create relationships, that might be a really big red flag, and to get them support, whether it's through a therapist or coach or whoever, that they get some support somehow. So this was very enlightening, Enrique, and thank you so much for the information. For everybody here tonight, we're going to be sending out an email, as we always do, with a link to some resources. And also, I think Enrique has given us the slide deck, so we will send that out as well. And if there's any follow-up questions, then you can get in touch with him too. We will make sure we have all of that information. Thank you so much.